This is a game between Magnus Carlsen, the reigning world champion at the time, and Gukesh, now the rising star who recently won the candidates. Starts off with Magnus playing b3, Gukesh plays e5, and Magnus targets the pawn immediately with his bishop. So, Gukesh brings his knight out, and we have c4 by Magnus. Now, d5 by Gukesh, Magnus takes, and Gukesh immediately puts his queen into the middle of the board, which gets targeted by a knight. So, we have Gukesh dropping the queen back, and Magnus bringing the knight into the middle of the board, developing more pieces. Gukesh brings a bishop out, Magnus pushes a pawn, Gukesh castles, and Magnus develops his bishop. We have f5 by Gukesh. This is all normal principled stuff, and castles by Magnus Carlsen. We have e4 by Gukesh. Maybe a little bit over push to these pawns, but we'll have to see. And Magnus plays knight g5. We have queen back all the way to its starting square, and f4 by Magnus Carlsen. Gukesh does not play en passant. Instead, he tries to kick out the knight. It works. The knight goes to h3, and we have knight f6 by Gukesh. Magnus plays the rook over to eye down the king, and the king steps out of its vision, and we have a3 by Magnus Carlsen. Now they just play a lot of waiting moves where they're just shuffling their pieces around and getting ready for an endgame, and Gukesh just moves his king over again. Very nice move. It's just a waiting move, waiting for Magnus Carlsen to initiate something. He brings his queen to b3, and now he's eyeing this knight. We have knight c6, and Magnus drops his bishop back. Gukesh moves his rook over. We have knight forwards. Now Gukesh plays g5. Magnus leaves the tension between these pawns and takes the knight instead. We have bishop takes back, queen takes, and knight takes. So rook takes. Now Gukesh has his rook in the middle of the board, and his pawns look a little bit nicer than Magnus. It's like Magnus is here in his cave over here, and Gukesh has this entire half of the board, and he's kind of intruding a little bit with his pawns. So we'll see what happens. Magnus plays rook c2, defending the d2 pawn, and Gukesh keeps on pushing his pawn, attacking the knight. Magnus forced to put his knight on a square that is not really good because all of these are cut off. He can't move his knight to any of those. This way doesn't even look the best, and he actually ends up dropping it here and rerouting it this way. So we have a5 by Gukesh, and Magnus takes. Gukesh takes back with the rook, and Magnus slides his rook to a1. We have bishop g7, and Magnus takes. Gukesh takes back with the rook, and Magnus reroutes his knight onto h1. We have Gukesh playing rook d7, targeting the d2 pawn, and then Magnus jumps out his knight, attacking this pawn. We have Gukesh playing king b8. Very odd move. I do not understand it, but it's okay. Magnus plays rook a2, and then Gukesh drops his knight back to d8, and he's going to reroute it. Maybe defend this pawn with something. And we have knight e6 by Gukesh. King over, pawn forwards, and king c7. Looks like they're going to get the kings into the game. We have rook b2 and rook d5. Now rook b4 and knight into the game, attacking this with two attackers. So Magnus has to make a counter threat. So this knight cannot take now. So he defends it. And now Magnus defends his pawn too. So we have Gukesh jumping into the middle of the board with his knight. And it's outposted. It looks really nice here. Magnus drops back to b1 with his rook. And Gukesh plays b5. Gukesh is looking about a point and a half better here on the evaluation. And Magnus just keeps on pushing his pawn. So Gukesh pushes his pawn too. And we have a6 by Magnus. This is a bullet game, so they're probably running low on time around here. This is move 42 out of 97. We have rook a1 and rook b5. Now Magnus drops his king back, and he's going to run it around. Gukesh keeps on pushing his pawn forwards. We have the pawn on b2, one away to promote, and Magnus stops it just in time, trades off a pair of rooks. Now it's knights and rooks, and Gukesh is up one pawn right now, and his advantage is slowly growing. So we have knight jumps out, and Gukesh drops his rook back. So we have king c2 attacking the pawn, and c5 by Gukesh, which drops a draw because Magnus can now take the pawn, and it's very unclear to see the draw, but Magnus plays the correct move so far, and Gukesh makes another slight inaccuracy, dropping his king onto the wrong square. Should have played king a6, he played king b6 instead. It doesn't make a big difference, but now Magnus takes the pawn and drops his knight back, and Gukesh puts his king towards the middle of the board, and he's going to try to get this pawn with his king. The rook defends the pawn, and now the knight is also defending the promotion square. So we have knight here defending the pawn again, and rook a7 trying to promote the pawn. We have pushing the pawn by Magnus, and Gukesh trades off the rooks. So now we have knights, and it's a completely drawing endgame, but I assume that Gukesh is up on time because he ends up winning this game. Magnus and Gukesh run around the board with their knights, and it's still equal even here. But a couple more moves later, when Magnus Carlsen lets Gukesh push his pawns too far, Gukesh ends up being winning in this endgame. He drops his pawn down, and now Magnus takes, and Gukesh makes a queen. Now it's a queen versus a knight and two pawns. We have table base to tell us that this is a win for black. You just have to do it correctly. Now, Gukesh is a grandmaster. Even though he was only 16 when this game was played, he was the youngest player to beat Magnus Carlsen when he was world champion. While he was world champion, I should say. And he's just moving his queen all around the board here. And he finally figures out to get his queen near the pawns, and Magnus is forced to push, and check with the knight, drop back to defend the pawn again. But it's futile because Gukesh plays a check, he runs his king away, and Gukesh plays queen d6. Now, Magnus pushes his pawn, but it doesn't matter. Gukesh takes back with the king, and in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigned. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.